The words were already out before my brain caught up to my mouth, and by the time it did, the damage was sitting right there in the room with us, impossible to take back. It's strange how a single sentence, said without thinking, can become the hinge your whole life swings on. I didn't know that yet. I just knew I wanted to crawl into the couch cushions and disappear. My name's Carter Holloway, and what I'm about to tell you happened 8 years ago, in a town outside Tulsa so small that everybody's business belonged to everybody else by sundown. I was 23 then, working the parts counter at a tractor supply store during the day and taking online business classes at night because I hadn't figured out what I wanted to be yet. My best friend since the 6th grade was a guy named Bryce Coleman. We'd grown up 2 streets apart, played JV football together, failed driver's ed together, the kind of friendship that doesn't need explaining, it just is. Bryce lived with his mom, Renata Coleman, in a 1-story house with a wraparound porch that always smelled like coffee and cut grass. His dad had taken off when Bryce was 8, headed out to Arizona for work, and never came back for more than a Christmas card. So it had been Renata and Bryce against the world for 15 years, and somewhere along the way, I'd become a fixture in that house, too. I had a key. I knew which cabinet had the good cereal. I knew Renata took her coffee black and complained about it every single morning anyway. Renata worked as an ER nurse at the regional hospital, 12-hour shifts that left her looking like she'd been through a war by the time she got home. But she had this thing about her, even exhausted, even in scrubs with her hair falling out of its clip. She carried herself like she knew exactly who she was. I'd noticed it plenty of times without really noticing it, if that makes sense. She was just Bryce's mom. That's the box I kept her in, because that was the only box that made sense. Then one Thursday night in October, everything got rearranged. Bryce and I were on the couch watching a Thunder game, a couple of pizza boxes on the coffee table, my feet kicked up on the ottoman like I owned the place. Renata came in from her shift, still in her scrubs, hair a mess, looking dead on her feet, but somehow still looking like herself. She gave us both a tired wave and headed toward the kitchen. Bryce called out something teasing about her looking like she'd lost a fight with a vending machine, and without even thinking, without one single second of filtering, I said it. Man, your mom's hotter than half the girls I've dated. I said it like a joke. It was supposed to land like a joke, a stupid throwaway line, the kind of thing you say to get a laugh out of your buddy. Except nobody laughed. Bryce went stiff next to me, jaw tight, staring at me like I'd just confessed to a felony. My stomach dropped through the floor. I tried to laugh it off, said something like, "Relax, man, I'm kidding." But the words came out thin and unconvincing even to my own ears. Renata had stepped in the kitchen doorway. She wasn't moving. She was just looking at me, and the expression on her face wasn't anger. I braced for anger. I would have understood anger. It was something closer to curiosity, like she was turning a coin over in her hand to see what was stamped on the other side. Then she said the thing that knocked the air clean out of the room. "So, you want to go out with me sometime?" I genuinely thought it was a joke. A two-can-play at this game kind of comeback. Bryce let out this nervous laugh, waiting for her to crack a smile and let us both off the hook. But she didn't she just held my eyes and said, "Real calm, I'm serious, Carter." I don't know how long the silence lasted after that. Felt like an hour, felt like nothing. I stammered out something about how I was just messing around, that I didn't mean anything by it, that it was a dumb joke and I was sorry. Renata just gave this small, knowing kind of smile, shrugged one shoulder and said, "Sometimes the dumb jokes are the only honest thing people say all week." Then she walked off down the hall to her room and left me and Bryce sitting there in a silence so heavy I could have drowned in it. He didn't say a word to me the rest of the night. I let myself out around 11 and drove home with the radio off, replaying the whole thing over and over, trying to figure out exactly where I'd gone wrong and how I could undo it. Here's the part I wasn't ready for, though. I couldn't stop thinking about her. Not in some immediate dramatic way. At first, it was just confusion, this itch in the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. Then it became something closer to curiosity. I started wondering what her days actually looked like, what she thought about on her drive home from 12-hour shifts, whether she ever regretted putting her whole life on hold to raise Bryce by herself. And eventually, and this part I really didn't want to admit, even to myself, it became something warmer than curiosity, something I had no business feeling. For a couple of weeks, I made excuses to stay away from the Coleman house. Told Bryce I was slammed with classes, which wasn't entirely a lie, but wasn't the whole truth either. Honestly, I didn't know how to walk back into that living room and act normal, not with Bryce there, not with Renata down the hall. Then one evening I had to swing by to grab a phone charger I'd left behind, figuring I'd be in and out in 2 minutes. Bryce wasn't home. He'd texted he was out with some friends. But Renata was in the front yard, kneeling by the flower bed, pulling weeds in the last bit of daylight. We ended up talking. Just small stuff at first. Work, my classes. Whether the Thunder had a real shot this year. But the conversation drifted somewhere deeper than I expected, the way conversations sometimes do when nobody's watching the clock. She told me how isolating it gets, spending 15 years putting every spare ounce of yourself into raising a kid alone, and then looking up one day and realizing you never built anything for yourself in the meantime. She talked about a nursing scholarship she'd given up on SAS because money got tight after Bryce's dad left. She talked about how strange it was, watching her son turn into a grown man right in front of her, knowing her job was basically done and she didn't know what came next for her. I listened. Really listened, in a way I hadn't with anyone in a long time. And somewhere in that conversation, I stopped seeing Renata Coleman as Bryce's mom, and started seeing her as a person who'd been quietly disappearing into other people's needs for 15 straight years. Over the next month, those conversations kept happening. Sometimes I'd come by under the excuse of returning a tool or dropping off something for Bryce, and I'd end up on the porch with her for 20 minutes, sometimes longer. We never brought up that night in the living room directly, but it sat underneath every conversation like a current running below still water. You could feel it even when neither of us said a word about it. Then, one night, sitting on the porch steps, with 2 glasses of sweet tea going warm between us, she said something that knocked the breath out of me all over again. Life doesn't really care about the rules people make up around it. Age, timing, what's appropriate. If you actually meant what you said that night, Carter, you owe it to yourself to be honest about it, even if nothing comes of it. Then she got up, told me goodnight, and went inside, leaving me sitting on those porch steps with my heart going like I'd just run a mile. I barely slept that night. I kept turning the same thoughts over. Bryce, loyalty, the unspoken rule that you don't even glance sideways at your best friend's mother. But underneath all that noise, I kept coming back to the way Renata's voice sounded when she said, "Be honest about it," like she'd been waiting 15 years for someone to ask her to be a person again, not just somebody's mother. A week later, I asked Bryce if we could talk. It might be the hardest conversation I've ever had in my life. I told him something had shifted in me, that I respected our friendship more than almost anything, and that I never meant for any of this to happen. Then I told him the part that actually mattered, that I thought I had real feelings for his mom. Bryce reacted about how you'd expect. He went quiet first, then furious. He said some things that night I'm not going to repeat, mostly because he had every right to say them. For months after that, he wouldn't answer my calls. We'd gone from texting every single day to nothing. Total silence, like 15 years of friendship had been switched off at the breaker. That stretch of time was the lowest I'd felt in years. I second-guessed everything. My intentions, my character, whether I'd crossed a line that should have stayed uncrossed no matter what. Renata and I barely spoke either during that period. She told me once, briefly, over text, that she didn't want to be the reason Bryce and I lost each other completely, and that she'd rather step back than watch that happen. But something shifted on Bryce's end, slowly, without me even knowing it was happening. He started noticing things about his mom he'd apparently never let himself see before. How quiet the house got once he wasn't around as much. How tired she looked even on her days off. How much of her life had simply gone into keeping the lights on for him. He told me later that one night he sat in the kitchen and just watched her eating dinner alone at the counter, scrolling her phone, and it hit him how much she'd given up and how little she'd ever asked for in return. About 5 months after that conversation on his couch, Bryce called me out of nowhere. His voice was different, steadier, older somehow. "If you ever hurt her," he said, "I will never forgive you. But if you're serious, actually serious, then I guess I'd rather you than some stranger she meets on an app." That was as close to a blessing as I was ever going to get, and honestly, it was more than I deserved. About a year after that night on the couch, Renata and I went on our first real date. Nothing extravagant. Dinner at a quiet steakhouse out past the edge of town, the kind of place with paper placemats and a salad bar nobody touches. We talked for almost 3 hours about everything. Her childhood in a small town in Missouri, my failed attempts at community college, the scholarship she still sometimes thought about finishing one day. It didn't feel like a fairy tale. It felt real, in a way that made every awkward, painful month before it makes sense. If you've ever had a moment where one offhand comment completely rearranged your life, you already know there's no clean way to explain it to people who weren't there. You just have to live through the after. 8 years out from that night, Bryce and I are closer than we've ever been. It wasn't a straight line getting here. There were holidays where the tension in the room could have cracked glass, arguments that resurfaced out of nowhere, stretches where I genuinely thought our friendship was something we'd buried for good. But time wears down even the sharpest edges if you let it. Bryce eventually told me something I think about a lot. He said love doesn't follow the neat little rules people like to pretend it does. It shows up in strange places, in conversations you didn't plan on having, sometimes right on the other side of the dumbest joke you've ever made in your life. Renata and I got married 2 years ago in her sister's backyard in Springfield, with Bryce standing up as my best man, which still doesn't feel real when I say it out loud. Every now and then, when the three of us are sitting around the table after dinner, somebody brings up that night on the couch, the pizza boxes, the Thunder game nobody actually remembers the score of, and we all end up laughing until somebody's wiping their eyes. It started with the dumbest sentence I've ever let slip out of my mouth. It turned into the family I didn't know I was supposed to have.